Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tom Bacon. I'm the COO of RiskPal. Thank you for joining this session on how to be a successful travel risk manager in 2025. Just a bit of housekeeping. We will be recording this session and there will be an opportunity to provide questions by the Q&A function, which we will address at the end. My colleague, Deanna, who, if you don't work with us already, no doubt will know, is going to help manage that, and we will address all the questions that we can given the time allocation. Just before introducing our wonderful panel and getting into the subject matter of today, just to give a description of what has brought this webinar together. This is the first in a three-part series looking at travel risk management, and it's done in partnership between RiskPal and ILS. International Location Safety, so ILS, are a specialist risk advisory, training and travel risk management organization. And us at RiskPal, we provide a digital risk assessment platform intended to improve user experience and boost duty of care and compliance. We have recently launched a partnership, and this is the first in a webinar between ourselves and ILS, and it combines the ILS Travel Risk Advisory Support Services and our digital risk assessment platform. So we see universities often struggle with high volumes and varied travel, as well as often disparate document and approval processes in a quite a fragmented way. So we've created a combined offering joining together the ILS Travel Risk Advisory Support Service and our risk assessment platform to hopefully provide an affordable expert service that will help you boost your duty of care and compliance to the sector. So as I mentioned, this is the first in a three-part webinar series on key travel risk management subjects. I'm just going to put a link into the chat where you can find out more about the upcoming webinars. So on the 4th of June, we have a session looking at profiles, resilience and response in travel risk management. And on the 2nd of July, so I'm just reading this from this one, a look at TRM tech tools and tips. So we are obviously surrounded every day in an abundance in this marketplace of solutions around travel risk management. So we are going to take a bit more of a deep dive look at that marketplace and assess what can help for universities. So on to today's session. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our panel. Karen Lawrence, who is the head of safety and security at Coventry University. Karen is also co-chair of the Travel Special Interest Group at USHA being the University Safety and Health Association. Hannah Eastwood is Risk Advisory Manager at ILS. Her team support a number of universities and other international organizations with pre-travel risk assessment and analysis. And Jamie De Freitas is the SVP of Sales and Account Management at Diversity Travel. Diversity, as I'm sure many of you who are attending will know, are one of the leading travel risk management companies serving the university sector. So thank you all for joining, and I'm really looking forward to today's discussion with you. But before I stop talking and pass over to you all, just a few contextual points for where we are with travel risk management today and the place that we find ourselves in. Undeniably, we cannot ignore that finances in the university sector are extremely stretched at the moment, which is adding additional pressures on travel managers to do more with less. We have those that are responsible for travel within the universities often wearing multiple hats. So not just being dedicated travel managers, but responsible for a whole range of security, safety considerations across a diverse portfolio of requirements. And often in most universities, it's very common to see that risk ownership is actually passed on to, or there is a mixture between the central core functions of safety, but the core risk ownership sits with departments and departmental heads. So what that can do is provide challenges when negotiating risk ownership. And that's something that when we look at today about key stakeholders and in terms of encouragement of participation in travel and risk management policies, we're going to get into and explore a bit further. So these kind of pressures and contexts make it all the more important that we as institutions work together and share best practices, which is what we hope today and brings us together, and what we will hope we will all get something from as some key takeaways into helping with regards to travel risk management. So going a bit more into the common challenges and the situation we are in today. Karen, if we could start with you. So from a travel manager perspective, from inside the university, what are some of the core issues that you're experiencing today?
I mean, apart from the three you've already said. Well, I mean, the finances is the big one, I think, at the moment. And it does make it harder. We are finding staff's remits are growing, so we're covering more things. And that's a challenge in terms of having the time to do things the way you'd like to have them done, and needing to find perhaps more efficient and more creative solutions. It also means we have to be very clear on why recommendations that are being made for safety are necessary, to give managers the full context when they're making decisions. But it also means that there are less travellers. So less funding tends, while there is still absolutely quite a bit of university travel going on, particularly in my institution, I'm seeing that's very much related to funded projects, student funding projects. So there's still quite a lot going on, but there is less than normal, which arguably is a good opportunity to really have to think about how you do things and maybe make improvements that you've been hoping for. The two you probably didn't mention that are quite sector specific are the concepts of academic freedom and the difference of opinion that can sometimes happen between academics about their right to go somewhere and what's needed, what's necessary, what's essential, and what the institution might consider within its risk tolerance. And then the other one would be that quite often, and in particular students, that they're returning to their home country. And so there can be a perception that therefore is completely fine and there is nothing to do with the university, no risk, nothing to see here kind of attitude. But actually, sometimes the nature of the work or the nature of their relationship with the university can change their risk profile. And sometimes that's a bit of a surprise to people when they stop and think.
Wonderful, thank you. And I think there's some really important things you've mentioned there that when we come to talk shortly around stakeholder engagement and having oversight of travel, we'll no doubt come back to throughout this talk. Jamie, from TMC observations, and I saw you smile with regards to the concept of academic freedom and some of the things that may challenges that may present from a TMC perspective. Working across so many universities, what do you see?
Yeah, so I think just really for follow on from Karen, generally we're seeing there's less people to do more work, and that's not just this sector; it's probably most sectors. But therefore, where there's less people, often we're seeing there's less expertise as well to manage travel risk as a primary example. So not every university is lucky enough to have a Karen like Coventry do, and therefore, you know, there's often not really a true ownership of travel risk in a university, because is it HR? They don't really want it. They're busy enough doing everything else. Is it procurement? They're busy doing the buying essentially. Is it, or does it fall somewhere else, maybe with a sort of a very senior super user travel manager? And actually that tends to be the biggest issue that we come across, is that we'll start working with an institution and maybe there's not full ownership of that topic, and therefore it's really difficult for us to sort of drive change and help them to meet their duty of care obligations. And that's all driven really from the funding challenges that have been very well documented and already discussed. And I think we'll talk about it probably more in the next areas of this discussion, but the lead in that has to travel policy compliance. If you so part one is having a policy in place, and then part two is getting that bought into, and when that's not bought into, that can create heaps of issues, and I'm sure we'll talk about them a little bit more. But yeah, that's all I've got to add on this one.
Great, thanks, Jamie. And Hannah, as a provider of risk advisory support, what are the common requests your team are receiving at the moment, and how do universities sort of differ from other organisations that you support?
Yeah, I would say that on the whole, there are probably more similarities than differences between the types of requests that we're getting from universities and organisations that focus on things like, well, research, but also human rights defence, freedom of expression, media, civil society organisations. Obviously, there are notable differences between them, and Karen and Jamie have alluded to some of those. But I think something that brings them, or some of the commonalities include the fact that researchers, whether they're doing it in a professional capacity on behalf of a think tank or on behalf of a university, they are quite close to the activism space. And because they're taking quite an anthropological, or the nature of their work is often quite anthropological, they are willing to take more risks in pursuit of their research goals, similar to human rights defenders and non-academic researchers. And so the kind of contexts that we're seeing that in specifically at the moment are primarily around the US. Obviously, the situation over there at the moment is changing very quickly and is quite unpredictable. There's been, as I'm sure many of you will have seen, reports of foreign nationals who have got all the relevant documentation and permits to work and study in the US are being denied re-entry. Researchers that are being invited to conferences on topics that are now kind of restricted or considered woke are now being denied entry upon arrival. And so with that, there's then, a lot of questions from researchers and students around this idea of self-censorship and these, being topics that they will often, be very passionate about and very curious about and potentially engaging with in their own countries. And what does that mean now that I'm traveling to somewhere like the US? Obviously, those kinds of questions and concerns aren't unique to America, but that was, up until very recently, it's, been quite a friendly environment to go into when, talking about these different issues that we often see students and university researchers looking to travel for. The self-censorship thing, I think, is one of the big ones. I think the US situation has prompted people to think more actively about it. And so a lot of the conversations that we're having are not necessarily about saying you need to self-censor, but if you don't want to self-censor, what is your risk profile off the back of this? How exposed are you off the back of this? And what mitigations do we need to put in place, and what realistically are the risks that you might face if, through the process of, applying for your visas, an online profile that is, very politically active comes through? What does that mean for you as a traveller? And does your institution have the appetite and the capacity to support you if something were to happen off the back of that?
Thank you. And that's something we work very closely as well with a lot of media organisations and see across the journalist spectrum as well as a core concern that's arisen in the last 100 days or so. So in terms of engagement and participation in your travel risk management program within a university, one of the common things is actually, one is the navigation in terms of who to engage with, and the other discussions come up around participation, particularly with regards to either risk assessment, so actually the completion of risk assessment, or with regards to travel bookings. And these are two things we often see. And when you're trying to implement a change with regards to travel policy and procedures, can often be things which are gaps that need occasional filling. So first of all, we're going to look at some mapping of the kind of who's who and useful to engage in if seeking to implement change in your travel risk management program. And I think, Karen, already you made some really good points around clear communications and actually outlining to decision makers the purpose of what you intend to do. But when we've done that mapping, we'll also look at any tips or solutions for encouraging better participation from colleagues in that travel process. So Karen, looking at the key individuals or departments that you need to engage with inside the university as your travel risk management program, can you help us do a bit of a sort of stakeholder mapping around that in some as far as you can?
And obvious ones around procurement, HR, insurance. You'll have probably a network of travel bookers, or certainly people who have accounts for booking travel. So that gives you a group of who's very active. There'll be some form of careers, globalization team, or teams if you're unlucky. who facilitate student mobility. There'll be some departments that are heavier travellers. So in my own case, we've got a Centre for Trust and Peace Studies that would be some of our riskier clients. And then we've got business development areas, which do a lot of corporate travel. Obviously your TMC, your travel risk advisory company, if you're lucky enough to have one. And we most should have something provided via their insurer. And I would strongly recommend getting to know them, what they expect, what they would find useful if things go wrong. Another group I found really helpful is the research ethics community and the ethics leads in our organisation, because a lot of our higher risk travel is research related. And we've had some real good traction in sort of embedding and linking processes that way. If you're planning to do anything systematic, you will need IT. Don't underestimate just how much you do need IT. And probably the last group I'd say, it's not a stakeholder as such, but the Usher Travel Group is a wonderful source of help. Everyone has banged their heads off whatever wall it is you're approaching, and we'll be happy to share their stories about how to maybe make it easier next time.
Brilliant, thank you. And that is a very comprehensive list, and sort of underlines some of the challenges that we have at hand in terms of pulling all the various parties together, especially in a world now of much more combined remote working and not being able to turn around and ask the person sat next.
I kind of missed the biggest name, which is whichever of single or multiple senior leaders should be leading on this, and not everybody has the luxury of one single leader picking this up. Sometimes you are dealing with more than one.
And so just to expand on that, would that be single, as we talked about the departmental structure around risk ownership, would that be senior leaders of those departments, or are there often individuals in a more central function that do assume responsibility for?
There's usually a senior executive team of one variety or another, all with different names in universities, but there will be some senior person who might take on the mantle of, I'm going to own the risk element for this. So that might be, quite often it's like a chief operating officer or operational administrative level area. You might have your head of HR, might feel that's them. It could be your international lead. There'll be different ones.
And the one thing, just to pick up on another point you mentioned that we've seen, and when we come to talk about information sort of overload later on, is it's amazing how many universities we've spoken to that haven't been aware of some of the third-party information feeds and risk advisory services available to them, even though it's part of typically their insurance or travel procurement package. And that
was us 10 years ago.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and it's great and I think when that is discovered, it's probably very enlightening, and it's a big burden and a great thing to have. So if anyone is if you haven't engaged with insurance, and you might well be about to uncover a very good resource that you might well have already.
I think some universities don't have a dedicated insurance manager, so it's more a thing that's managed by a procurement and a broker. But without that linchpin kind of person, the communication about what your policies and services could be is not as easy.
Thank you. And Jamie, what challenges do you experience in terms of when you're implementing your travel services within a university? And often, who will you be engaging with to work on that?
Yeah, sure. So I think hopefully a complementary answer to Karen again. I think generally we see most successful travel contracts, the ones where there is real buy-in from all areas of the university. And as Karen says, it sort of has to start from the top. I was at a university event in Riga last month, and the bottom line was there's only so much you can do without the buy-in from senior leadership at university. Now they were talking about building a sustainable culture and resilience, but I think the same principles apply here. But then you can't pin it all on leadership either, directing the right behaviours. Yes, that's critical, or at least very important, but all stakeholders, and Karen's talked about this already, but from travellers, finance, HR, international office, green office, the digital transformation team, everyone needs to be bought in, and everyone has a responsibility to participate. and follow that travel policy and contract. And I think that's why, in terms of implementation, we encourage our customers to build a really diverse panel from day one. I think we're seeing more often now that actually at the beginning of a procurement process, they will get a wider panel together with stakeholders from different departments, and it's really important to do that. But we always say with at least one senior sponsor, to go back to Karen's point. And it's also why we then invest so much time engaging with different departments directly and sort of trying that sort of dual approach where there's sort of the policy and the internal communications pushing the message about why the travel contract's so important around travel risk and managing that duty of care. And then we also push that message face to face where we can, online with the client, with as many of the stakeholders, the travelers, the travel bookers as possible. I think ultimately, if it's the travel manager, that's a really tough job in a decentralized, multi-faculty institution.
I was going to say, I think there's only a few universities who've got roles specifically around managing travel, but a lot of them have now started to form a working group, a steering group, a kind of coordinating body with the key stakeholder people on it, which is helpful.
Right. Well, I imagine that is a really key way of bringing together those multi parties. So, Hannah, as one of those expert third parties mentioned in terms of risk advisory support, tell us a bit around who your teams often will engage with at universities and their involvement in the risk assessment process.
I think in comparison to Jamie and Karen, we have it quite easy because we are normally given a health, safety and security type focal point, normally somebody like Karen, who acts as the gatekeeper between the various stakeholders within the institution and then the team at ILS. And so for the most part, our engagement is with that safety and security focal point or travel manager focal point. The way that we sometimes expand on that is if, for example, a traveller is going to a particularly high-risk location, or there are elements of their profile that they're quite concerned about, and then we might have a briefing, one-to-one briefing with them to kind of go through their risk assessment documentation, their concerns that maybe aren't captured on paper. And sometimes we also do travel safety and security training, in which we will go to the university and do a one-day whistle-stop tour of travel safety and security support and risk mitigation best practice. The ways that I think we do engage with travellers, notwithstanding when they request that more direct support, are through the documentation that they submit to their safety and security focal point. So people that they're equivalents to people like Karen. I would say on the whole, the forms that we receive are the ones that the focal points at the universities either don't feel that they've got the expertise in, or want a second pair of eyes on the risk assessment that the student has carried out. The forms themselves obviously are only as good as the information that's provided by the traveller, but they will include things around obviously the details of their itinerary, the practical stuff. But something that we see a few universities do that I think is a really valuable tool is almost like a risk identification questionnaire type of document. This is, I would say, most appropriate if you're doing more complicated travel or more sensitive, research. And this is about the traveller identifying specific risk factors. So this is not only your physical and digital risks that are associated with the context, but also the work that they're doing. So how sensitive is the topic? How delicate are the methodologies that you're going to be adopting in gathering your research? How long are you away for? And as a consequence of that, what risks might, develop or you might be exposed to? And a lot of the time that can be much more around the mental health and well-being side of things. And then the ethical implications, and something that I think Karen alluded to is something that we really advocate for, is the making sure the Venn diagram between the security team and the ethics team overlaps a little bit more than it perhaps does in some cases, and understanding that an awful lot of stuff around the ethics and the cultural sensitivity and sometimes the conflict sensitivity piece, it has an ethical implication, but it also potentially has a security implication. And so when those kinds of situations happen, or we see research of that that veers into that kind of territory, that's when we would often advocate for that one-to-one, or for the traveller to attend some traditional safety and security training. But yeah, on the whole, we have one focal point, which is much easier than than what Karen and Jamie alluded to.
Wonderful, thank you. And some of the areas that you talked on there in terms of the mental health and wellbeing component and the profile management as well, which I know can be a key part of a risk assessment, are subjects which we will be looking at in more detail in the next webinar next month.
Yeah,
brilliant, thank you. So then the tips around sort of stakeholder engagement, and one of the aspects that we really want to do is kind of part of the change management process and encouraging participation from colleagues. So you mentioned, I think the key thing is about sort of working groups, steering committees, in terms of gaining that participation. From all of you, really, if there's any key tips and things that you've seen really succeed, evidently recognizing it's a marathon rather than a sprint, I think, sort of implementing changes in policies and processes, but really welcome, any things that you've seen that have been successful in using new travel processes. Perhaps Karen.
So some of the things that worked best for us were finding key champions in departments that could come, be your voice in the research community or other areas. So finding those champions, which we often picked out from training, and that's for that on the ground voice, and also feeding back to you if your processes are the problem, because if they are, then you need to tackle it. And then the other part has been I think our approach at integrating risk trigger questions into our ethics process, and there's a travel approval process that we're bringing in. So these are sort of systems that help to highlight things and let us cross-reference. So ultimately, in order to get travel permission, you've to get through one system or another, both of which have got those filters built in to spot the ones that need extra love.
Okay, wonderful, thank you. And one of the things, Jamie, I was wondering if you've seen from a TMC perspective, if there's a well-known sort of challenge sometimes, and going back to the original point around concepts of academic freedom, but is the off-grid or the rogue travel. And just wondering around what you've seen in terms of from a TRM, TMC process, and what challenges that can really present.
Yeah, so I think the short answer is sort of a frustrated yes, probably on behalf of Karen's side and our side, that there is still a fair amount across the sector. In the previous answer, we talked about the lack of stakeholder buy-in or the impact that has on the successful adoption of the travel contracts. But I think one of the big challenges is that travel is very emotive. In 2025, most of us consider ourselves to be travel experts, right? So most of us book our own holidays online. We all think we can beat the system and find the lowest price. So it's almost like a personal challenge when you're booking these things. So sort of imagine being, a senior lecturer at university who's really intelligent, leader in their field, or frankly any individual that works at or is connected to a university, and then being told that the university has implemented a new travel agency and travel policy, sometimes at the same time, those two things, for all the right reasons, by the way, all the ones we're discussing today, but that they can no longer then book travel the way they always have. And I once got it described to me as they've taken away my freedom completely. It's sort of exactly what you guys have alluded to today. And I think when the engagement hasn't been managed well, that is the single biggest barrier for the universities in achieving the sort of the contract compliance. And then I think on top of that, or as a sort of a side anecdote, in the public sector, it is especially hard to fully mandate a contract, as it's seen as public funds, and therefore you have to prove almost on every trip that you're selecting the lowest value fare every time. So we've seen instances where a traveller has spent 3 hours at whatever the rate is, they get paid an hour to save £4 on a ticket they found on some third-party website that's probably unsecure and that generally a TMC won't touch. But they really see that as they don't worry about that side of things. They really do want to save every pound that they can, every penny that they can, so they can put as much of the funds as they can towards the project, because they're very passionate about the project. And I think, as a TMT that specializes in this sector, we really get that. But it just means it's a headache every time. And unless you have a really strong policy and the right internal comms, that conversation doesn't go away quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. And we see that in terms of just from a risk assessment perspective, is actually it's about making things easier rather than harder. It's one of the key things, because actually if you ignore the user experience of the end user and then actually think, well, they can jump through 3 different forms and submit them via email and various different formats, it can present quite a lot of challenges and resentment, and actually almost encourage people to skip the system in some degrees. And I think that's something that putting the user at the heart of what you're implementing, I think is critical throughout.
And I think we've seen that quite a lot recently. There's been a bit of a shift. I think if you go back 5 years, a lot of universities like, right, we need to control the budget, which of course, like, it's very obvious why. But the reality of that is meant the booking journey was very cumbersome. And I think most of the sector now is really recognizing that to get the buy-in, one of the quick ways is to make it really easy for them to book and really highlight and shout about the benefits, because there are many benefits to it as well. So yeah, I agree with that completely.
The other part we do occasionally see is sometimes risk on a risk management perspective more broadly, whether that's sort of focused on sort of occupational health and safety or travel safety, or even your campus security, is having it purely through the prism of a risk manager can also totally alienate if it's purely in risk management language, which, as we work in that sector, but it can be very difficult for someone to quantify their, severity, likelihood, residual risk scores for different areas that they're not familiar with, that lingo, and actually working around that basis and helping. And I think this is part of, again, going back to the working committee idea and what you said around gauging feedback from your users is so important in terms of actually evolving. So being willing to evolve a travel risk process, and I think that's something that, again, is really good to keep capturing that feedback, sort of the continual improvement point. But staying in the theme of the sort of road travel, and Hannah, just from a sort of incident and crisis management response point of view, just wonder your thoughts on when you do have outside the system travelers and then an incident does occur, just some of the types of challenges that can present in terms of ability to respond and help those affected in the event of an incident.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I think something that's always quite interesting when we look at university travellers, but also within the development and the aid space, is that what is often seen as rogue travel for people based in HQ is not rogue travel for the researchers themselves. We and I say this from previous work in kind of humanitarian operations. If you mention Goma and even the DRC generally to people that regularly do research or focus on Africa, yes, it's high risk, but actually it's a pretty, I say normal in with very big inverted commas, compared to a lot of other sectors that we kind of work alongside. When you then kind of add to that the fact that researchers operate in a grey space, the fact that there are discussions around the ethics and the security risks associated with their research, it's not clear cut trying to prepare for that and respond to that. And so if we then kind of think, okay, the benchmark is rogue, rogue is normal, then we can we can start to think about, okay, what can we do to prepare as an institution, and what can we also do to prepare the individual, and then also about our response capabilities. And I think for us at ILS, an awful lot of what we advocate for is the preparedness side of things, so that it then enables a more effective and swifter response if something were to happen. I think in that is kind of assuming that travellers are going to be adopting pretty unconventional means of travel. They're often not going to know the exact details of their itineraries, who they're going to meet. And I can put my hands up and say that I've done, kind of research-based projects in the past where I've kind of gone out of the capital city for an afternoon and been in the back garden of a local activist's house talking with them over a beer about what they do. I'm sure there are researchers that do that kind of thing all the time, because they're incredible opportunities to really develop that nuanced local understanding that they ask for. And so recognizing as an institution that that's probably going to happen, and therefore what do we need to put in place to allow researchers to feel and students who are traveling to feel comfortable highlighting that they're going off-piste. So having things like dynamic risk assessments, regular check-ins where they feel, kind of comfortable saying, my itinerary this week is going to be, involving some of this, this and this. Are you happy with this? Let's check in at these times. These are some extra mitigations that either I as the traveller want to employ, or that the institution would like me to employ in order to do that. It's exactly like you were saying, if you don't make space for that to be an empowering conversation rather than a tick box exercise, you will get people doing things without telling you, and then it makes the response side of it so much harder and more difficult to manage, because there's just too much unpredictability. And then with that, it's kind of about them understanding as travellers that understanding as travel risk managers that if we can make that risk assessment process, both the initial one and the ongoing one, almost quite like intellectually stimulating, have it as briefings, conversations, ongoing, check-ins, so that it doesn't just feel like a box that they had to tick at the beginning, but that actually this is part of how they, need to do their research. It then, from our experience, means that the preparedness side of things is tighter and the response is better, because people feel much more comfortable talking transparently about what they're doing, where they're going, why they're doing it, what they're, the mitigations that they're bringing in. And it leaves the institutions themselves more informed, so that they can, respond hopefully more effectively if something happens.
And I think that last point on having the conversations and more openness and transparency can really facilitate a more detailed engagement and clarity. And I think that's a really key area. So thank you. And Karen, one of the things we didn't mention, well, first I wonder if you've got any experiences in terms of incident management with any wanted to share around any difficult travels type scenarios. And then the other aspect is around just to understand what you do from a training perspective, which is something we didn't really talk around travel management training, because we talked around systems and engagement policies, but evidently there is a training aspect as well. It'd be interesting to understand your experiences there.
Yeah, I don't know a particular example of an incident I want to get into, but I think one of the most complicating factors is people change their phone numbers as soon as they go away, and they don't tell you what their new number is. I think that is consistently one of the most difficult things because then there's a delay in getting in touch with them. And a system that works really well doesn't work so well once you don't know someone's phone number. And you're going to ask me later what the one thing is. That's probably the magic wand I'd wave, is make it so that people's phone numbers automatically update. And what was the second part of your question?
It's around training.
Right, okay. Yeah. So we have a basic level e-learning package all travellers are requested to do. And then we actually use ILS to do some of our training. So travellers going to more riskier places would then go through the ILS training, and we keep a record of that. So it's primarily one research centre. So they tend to keep a track of who their travellers are, and they don't authorise their travel if they haven't done the training, which is quite a big step forward for us.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, that's great. Okay, brilliant. So one of the sort of last topics I want to just talk about further is about seeing through the noise amid an abundance of information feeds that we all receive on a daily basis, and how that when you're surrounded by information and constant feeds is how you can see is that relevant to travelers that you may have in the field. I mean, it links to the earlier discussed issue around institutions don't have dedicated travel managers, let alone dedicated analyst teams that will be sat and or on a response capability ready to go 24/7 that we do see in some of the corporate world. So I'm just wondering, and we constantly, every day, every week, are seeing incidents that do throw up those questions. We've seen the escalations between India and Pakistan taking place in the last 24, 48 hours. We've seen just last week or week before with regards to power outages in Spain, Portugal. There's an ongoing number of conflicts in long-term conflicts, Ukraine, Sudan, Gaza. There's the US travel border issue that Hannah alluded to. So there's a constant number of geopolitical events that we're having to kind of keep across, which is incredibly challenging. And what we won't talk on today, and it's a subject for our third webinar, is around sort of technological tips, if we like. But just wondering, how do you kind of try and maintain oversight, and what tips you've got perhaps to understand where travelers can be and what challenges face with that abundance of information. So maybe Karen could speak to that first.
We have quite good compliance with our TMC booking, so a lot of staff travel is picked up that way, and then it's imported into a platform which my travel risk management company would monitor for me. So they contact travellers if they identify them in proximity, and they will also let me know if we need to kick off a response to a situation. That doesn't tend to capture student travel for placements and internships and mobilities abroad. So we have a team that manage those placements, and they review any going abroad and ensure the student has downloaded the app and have. They aren't so great at always adding to their itinerary, but they do tend to check in so that we do know that they're there. So between those two pools, I'd say, I'm not saying it's impossible that something falls through my net, but I think we have a good view of most things. And our TMC, my travel risk company, is really good at flagging, we need to look at this one. And we meet very regularly and look at who's coming up next and is there a worry to be had with that. So that's how I do it.
Fantastic. And again, good engagement with the people you work with is kind of at the heart of that. So that's fantastic. Hannah, what are the common types of incidents you see that like most often affect travelers in this space?
Mute myself. I must admit the context that you alluded to at the beginning of this section generally are the ones that we've had the most exposure to in the last few months. There was civil unrest in Bangladesh last autumn, where a student was stuck in Dhaka, and fortunately they weren't caught up in the protests, but they weren't able to reach the airport, and so there were travel implications around that, and we played a role in advising the decision making around them wanting to stay in country and wait for the protests to subside so that they could continue with their research, compared with the institution's risk appetite and their wanting for them to return to the UK. I think that example, along with us, sometimes getting reports of travellers being in locations that the university wasn't expecting them to be in, seems to be I say the most common two, but they do happen infrequently. And I think what both of those examples lend themselves to is perhaps the traveller's unfamiliarity with the university's red lines. So what is the upper limit of the university's threshold? And different departments within the university might have different appetites. You know, the more kind of sociological and political and, you know, development related departments are probably going to have a greater risk appetite than ones whose whose students either don't travel very much or potentially only go to conferences, for example, in capital cities. And so, you know, understanding where that top line is and therefore how far the traveller can go in terms of the risks that they take on and the type of work they do, I would say that seems to be then where the incidents start to creep through. And with that then comes contingency plans, and that's less about incidents themselves, but more that travellers they seem to take an all or nothing approach. And generally that then means that they either try to cover every eventuality, which is impossible. And I think it's then on us as travel risk managers to educate them on that it's impossible to eliminate risk. Or they kind of just say, oh, I've got my embassy's phone number, and they think that that's a contingency plan. And meeting them somewhere in the middle, I think it's not an incident, but it's a challenge that we regularly come across, and trying to manage that expectation and get them thinking critically, but not to the point that they're, you know, terrified to travel and because they haven't thought of every single possibility.
Yeah, okay, wonderful. Thank you. And talking of those red lines, they can also be on a departmental or sort of seniority basis in the university. But the other key area with that we see often is around insurance. So some will just have blanket prevention. And I think working, and that might be through a TMC channel where a certain destination is identified and it triggers a different workflow to prevent travel to certain areas or have a different approval route, can be good ways to help identify that at the early stage as well, rather than later. Jamie, I guess from a TMC perspective, I think we talked about this briefly last week. I imagine it's more those mass disruption type nationwide power outages and travel kind of major disruption events that are probably create the bigger headaches for TMC like yours. But I was just wondering, yeah, what tends to be the most disruptive, and what issues do you see that you can get asked about that can trigger an overreaction to as well, and lots of inquiries to you to in terms of misunderstanding perhaps from your clients?
Yeah, sure. So I think it's been covered pretty well across you guys, but most of the, or let's say some of the most disruptive incidents are typically relatively boring ones. You know, it's cancelled flights, power cuts, but they have such a mass impact on so many people. And I think, you know, earlier we talked about travel is always emotive, but I don't think it's ever more sensitive or emotive or stressful than during these scenarios. And I think it's in those moments that, like, naturally human beings are sometimes a little bit less logical, and sort of panic sets in, and they don't think about the process, what they should do. And then from a TMC's perspective, we then get, not only do we have, you know, if you take the Heathrow example, we have something like 700 flights to book or rebook and that side of things, but then you have an influx of calls from travellers wanting to make sure that, you know, that their work is still able to go ahead. Is everything going to be okay? What do they do? And I think ultimately it comes down to a really strong, again, going back to the travel contract, the travel policy, really strong communication. What do we do in this scenario? From our side, and I'm sure all TMCs try and do the same thing, is, you know, we try and make all of the contact layers as simple as possible. There's, you know, the 24-hour number is on all documentation, so they at least know who to call in the event of an emergency. But actually, quite often we find with some of our partners that there is an internal policy that should be followed first. So whether that's an internal person they should contact, when is the insurance triggered? But I think having all of that in one place and everyone being familiar with that makes it a much more successful process in the heat of the moment. And yeah, but I mean, there's no silver bullet, because these incidents seem to be more and more frequent. And as we alluded to at the beginning, there's less and less resource typically to support these. But I think having the right communication, the right process, and everyone being familiar with it, that's the key to minimizing the stress levels and the impact of these scenarios.
Great, thank you. And before, I did have another question we were going to pick up, but we've got a really good set of questions from the attendees here. So I'm just going to jump into some of those, if I may. The first one, which is around which key stakeholders would you have part of your group? I think, Karen, you outlined that very well earlier on. And I think what we'll do there is after today, we'll probably try and share some outcomes or recommendations from this webinar. So we'll send around that along with perhaps a bit of stakeholder mapping of some key parties to engage with. Got a really good question here from Gareth, which is about looking at travel at a third-party invitation. So where another institution is covering the flights and accommodation, and it might fall outside the system. It says commonplace on joint research awards, external examiner work, that was hard to say, vivas, etc. And I just wondered, Karen, maybe that's something you've got experience with.
And it can be complicated. Some of the issues it can cause is if the third party is organising your arrangements or your logistics, how many minutes before you travel are you actually going to find out what those are? And it does rather make risk assessing something you're not 100% sure what they plan really difficult. So the ability to push back to that supplier and say, no, actually, my risk management team really needs to hear this now, or they can't approve my trip, is one element. Another one would be where you are sharing. We've had issues. I think it doesn't really matter which way around you go, but decide whose emergency response plan's covering this. You know, is it yours? Is it your insurance, or is it the partners? You don't really want that situation where nobody knows quite who it was that should have been dealing with it.
Yeah, that's really key, and we see that in so many, in terms of an emergency response, is actually people trying to, from a third party perspective, actually, yeah, the delegation of responsibility is absolutely vital. I think that's a really, really important point. Thank you. We have a question from Kelly. Do you have examples of the questions asked as part of the risk assessment ethics process to flag that someone might be a higher risk traveller? So key types of questions or areas that we might ask in that risk assessment process. Hannah, do you want to talk perhaps to that? And sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and of course. So I think the most obvious ones that I think we all default to are around the threat environment, which is a very kind of military sounding term, but it's basically about what are the risks that exist from a quite physical safety and security perspective. So things around civil unrest, history of conflict, infrastructure, crime, things like that. The ones where it then we can then kind of tap into that further is, I would argue, probably quite a lot more nuanced. So it's about the traveller's profile, and this can be as much about the elements of their profile that are quite visible, such as ethnicity, age, gender, but also the kind of more less obvious signs, so language skills, sexuality, things that potentially might make them more vulnerable or more secure, depending on the environment that you're talking about. And I think certainly from the conversations that we've had with travellers, students are more mindful of those elements of their profile and what they can mean with regards to the extent to their vulnerability. The research sensitivity and the methodology, I think some topics are going to be very obviously more controversial than others, but I think even some of the topics that we've spoken with students about, where it will be, I don't know, around, I think one of the students was going to travel to Mongolia or to Nepal and live with an agricultural community for 6 months. And what does it, the sensitivities around that are, okay, do you speak the language? Yes or no? What does that mean for the acceptance that you're going to get in that host community? What methodologies for like data collection are you going to employ, bearing in mind you've got that language barrier? But also, recognizing what does agriculture mean in that community and in that country? Are there a lot of pressures on that community? So having you as an outsider present. What does that mean? And so that became something that they weren't in a very high risk environment, in that it wasn't, you know, an active conflict setting, there wasn't loads of demonstrations, but your presence as an outsider, what does that mean? And I suppose it's like I was mentioning earlier, it's that grey space. You know, there's going to be no clear answer to this, but I think blending the ethical process around getting research approval and the security process, and kind of seeing if there's some collaboration that can happen between those two teams who don't necessarily come together often because of the volume of students you're talking to, can be some places that we think about those more nuanced elements that are certainly worthy of consideration.
Brilliant, thank you. That's really, yeah, really extensive things to consider. Thank you very much.
I'll add one.
Oh yes, please.
It's very pragmatic, but are you going to a capital city, or are you going out travelling miles to somewhere quite remote where help is going to be really delayed? It just makes it way more complicated.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you, Karen. So we've got 5 minutes left. I'm going to try and cover off the remaining questions. So one is regarding regular check-ins. What do people typically do when traveling to high-risk destinations? In particular, how are weekend check-ins usually managed, considering the additional workload this may create for staff who are not working? So I think one of the things I imagine might be part of this is around, there are third-party travel companies, and I think, Karen, you've mentioned that previously, that you will receive support in regards to that. Yeah, sorry, go on, and then maybe we can talk to Jamie as well around diversity options there.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what we do, and I don't particularly want to ever go back to the position where it was me.
Yes, absolutely.
Some universities is still very much checking with their research supervisors or management. And that can be difficult over the weekend. Some universities are using their internal security services because they're a 24/7 point of contact, but that can be difficult if they then wouldn't know how to escalate or what they would do. So it's quite a big shift to bring that in, but some have used that successfully.
Thank you. And Jamie?
Yeah, not too much to add. I think we of course have sort of options in place to help people with those check-ins via sort of a travel risk platform that we have. But ultimately, I think the important thing for the university is, again, I feel like a bit of a parrot today, but just having that clear process for these different scenarios, and having a strong policy around it so that people follow it. So, you know, whether it is a more manual check-in, whether you're working towards utilizing a technical solution, just having that clear process is the hard bit to implement, and then choosing the best way to do it is more straightforward once you have the buy-in.
Thank you. There is a question. I'm going to combine two questions because I saw one from Steph regarding capturing feedback from the travellers upon return from travel, the things that went well, didn't, etc., and the lessons learned process. Any tips on how to approach this, encourage feedback from the travellers? Well, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to link that to a question from Kevin. Thank you about the ISO 3130 framework. Well, the feedback from travellers is a key component of that framework. Had we had time, I wanted to explore that framework further and understand a bit more about experiences and usage of the framework's guidelines. But what I would say is what we do at RiskPal, we realize that a manual process is not feasible for large volumes of travellers. So we've actually built in an automated feedback traveller loop, which in terms of when you have a return date, you can determine if you want to send out a preset of questionnaires, which then goes into a sort of pool, and you can then capture the feedback that way. But very interested to know other experiences there in terms of that you've got with that process.
I think just to maybe a quick side note, we for a different topic, one of our universities in the Netherlands have actually incentivizing their travellers to try and get some feedback on a slightly different area. But I think it doesn't have to be anything significant because, you know, it talks about funding cuts and everything else. But I think if there's an opportunity to do something that can drive some traction and get the feedback we need to make a difference, then yeah, it might be a quick fire solution.
Thank you. And yeah, that idea of gamification as well, in terms of as well as incentivization, can sometimes be something that works as well. So just linked to that with regards to ISO 3130 and how, if we see that really being something that is being used as a travel risk management sort of the guidelines, evidently it's not certifiable at the moment, but is that something that there is much talk, perhaps Karen, in the USHA, in the travel committee, is that something that comes up regularly?
Yeah, so we decided that there was not really any great need in us producing extra guidance, because that document does a really good job.
Yeah.
And I would say that's a good place to look. What we tend to focus on are practical approaches to doing the things that advises. And the answers for all of us always look a little bit different, but they always have a bit of something in common. So we're very much more at that sort of technical level of how do you do that, not what do you do. I think that framework sets it out perfectly.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's an excellent framework. The one last point, there's a question from Agnes around evolving geopolitical landscape and how you combine real-time intelligence, digital risk monitoring. I'm going to leave that, if we may, because that is going to be likely one of the key subjects for our third webinar series. And then just looking at the last question, if we do have time, and to confirm on one that yes, there will be a recording of this webinar sent out to all attendees. What tips do you have for engaging travellers going to their own country to conduct field work? So what tips do you have for engaging travellers going to their own country to conduct?
Yeah. I can take a punt on this one first, if you like, Karen. This is something that we talk a lot about, and it speaks to one of the other questions, I think, about the fact that often when people are traveling to their home country, there's a degree of complacency because to a large extent, they do understand the risks, but with that can sometimes become, sometimes we can see some fairly lax approaches to then managing risks should they materialize. I think one of the things to help mitigate that is having a conversation about that, not to accuse the traveller of complacency or underappreciation of risks, but to say, look, we acknowledge that there are an awful lot of assets associated with your profile and, the elements of your profile that mean that you are more secure than somebody else might be going to your home location, but that we do ultimately need to have a conversation about the fact these risks do still exist, and how can we utilize the strengths associated with your profile whilst also recognizing the vulnerabilities. And it might mean that the mitigations are very specific rather than just about contextualizing best practice. Karen, I don't know if you wanted to add something.
Yeah, it's similar. So with the sort of description document that I've got kind of outlining what do I think high risk is and what isn't, we very much show that on the bottom end of the scale, local knowledge can be a huge benefit. But at the same time, we try to approach it on the point of view of, well, yes, you're going home, but you're not going home to just live at home. You're going home to work for the university or study for the university. So what different things is that putting in your, what difference does that make to your risk profile? Are you at more risk because you're doing something for us? Are you going to part of the country you wouldn't normally go? In the case of my students, I've had several wanting to go to refugee camps and parts of their country that are quite challenging and ask questions that won't be popular. And I've tried to explain that, your family isn't a security company and you might get them into just as much trouble as you. And we usually do that through the ethics lead, the research supervisor, myself, coming together and talking about it. And we've often find that once you explain the problem, they go, oh yeah, and then it's easy to find a compromise.
Wonderful, thank you. And I think that just draws on something that's come throughout really, in terms of what would be perhaps one key takeaway for success is actually communication is such an important part of an engagement, is such a critical feature or characteristic of what will help make you a successful travel risk manager in 2025. I'd just love to take this moment to say thank you so much to the three panelists, Karen, Hannah, Jamie. I found it a really valuable discussion. Thank you to everyone who has attended. We will follow up with a recording of this event, and I hope you can join us for webinars 2 and 3 over upcoming months. Thank you all incredibly, and have a good rest of the day.